Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Earliest Memory of a Nightmare Turned Out to Be Real by Best Mossad Agent. So, the title sounds like a no-sleep story, and that's the first thing I thought when I first found out about this 2 months ago. I've been busy dealing with the wake of a family tragedy since then, but now that things are returning to the new normal, I figure it's a good time to share. First, I'll describe the nightmare. It was a very short dream, and like I said, it's a very clear memory just because of how scary it was. I was about 4 or 5 years old, perhaps 6 at the most, and my twin brother and I had a bunk bed in a room at the furthest end of the house we grew up in. In the nightmare, I was in my bed looking out the window to see a red sky, the kind it gets like in the early dawn hours before sunrise, but light still colors the sky. The next and only other thing I remember in this nightmare is that a man with crazy blue-colored eyes and a bald head appeared at the window and stared right at me. The nightmare ended there, but I remember just screaming and screaming about it. I don't know where my brother was at the time when I woke up screaming, and the only thing I could remember from when I woke up was having my mom come and get me and calm me down as she took me to her bedroom down the hall. I only remember that so well because I wondered where my dad was at the time. Fast forward to this May, and my father was in the hospital in the country he lives in, Colombia. My twin brother and our older sister were staying in a hotel about a 5-minute walk away from the hospital where my father was in the ICU. One night after a long day of being there for Dad and for the extended family, my siblings and I returned to the hotel and sat together to have a couple of beers and try to relax after all of that. We started discussing things, just trying to unwind, but somehow the discussion of nightmares and dreams came up, and I bring up the above story. Without missing a beat, my sister straight up explained that had really happened, and some guy really did look through my windows and that she remembered the whole thing. My sister, who was 5 years older than my brother and I, this would make her around 9 or 10 when it happened, had her bedroom adjacent to the bedroom my brother and I shared. Her room faced our front lawn and street while our room faced the neighbor's house and their driveway with a very low fence between the two houses. While she didn't get into too much detail about the days before this nightmare or event, she said that she had been followed by a bald man in a truck as she rode her bike home with some friends a couple of times before. The day immediately before this nightmare was no different, but the man this time actually drove right past our house. At the time, she was a latchkey kid since my brother and I had to go to a special school about 45 minutes away from our hometown for a speech impediment that many twins have. My mom had to pick us up rather than be home for my sister after school, but she was never home alone more than an hour. That afternoon and evening were pretty normal as she remembered it. My dad came home from his job, and he worked as a part-time cop and worked in a local hardware store too. We all had dinner, did our homework, played and did usual family things before bed. That night, around 12 or 1, this bald-headed dude had parked down the street at a small industrial park and walked up to our house and tried to get in through my sister's window. That woke her up, and she screamed when she saw the man nearly opening the window, as it wasn't locked. My dad stormed in and tried to shove the guy out or tried to hit him with the nightstick he had. My sister doesn't remember exactly what happened there, but this caused the guy to run off, but only for a short time, as he came back a little later to try to get into the window of my room. He tried opening the window, but it was locked because my mom didn't want my brother and I to open it. Our bed was right up against it. My sister said I screamed as loud as I could, and my mom went in to get my brother, while my dad tried to go after this guy by running out the front door, but it was all for no avail. The guy hauled ass right through our backyard. The way our backyard was situated, it backed right up against a small rail yard that is part of the aforementioned small industrial park down the street from us. Between our small neighborhood and that rail yard was a good amount of very dense trees that always made the backyards very, very dark. So my dad didn't want to go back there and get attacked by him, and instead went back inside to the house, called the police, and then our elderly neighbor to make sure that they were okay. Mom was taking care of us kids. That's all my sister could remember from that night herself, as it was a very long time ago. Neither of us could recall anything else after that either, and the story just sort of stops right there. Sadly, my father passed away in hospital, so we aren't able to ask him, and given that none of us have thought to ask our mom yet, but maybe we will ask her soon. For now, to the bald-headed creep who tried to do God knows what to my family, let's not meet. Joe the Contractor by Count Curlyfluffs. I'll preface this with the fact that we are entering into the building phase of our house right now, so I'm meeting a lot of contractors and new people. We've been having trouble finding someone to do our foundation, and over the last month I have called tons of people who said they can't do the job but know someone who can, and then they give me their name and number. I call, get the same answer, rinse and repeat. After a lot of this, I finally landed on the number of a guy named Joe. Joe sounded excited to do the job and was the most responsive and also the nicest person I've run into so far contractor-wise. We set up a meeting time and he came out to my place to see the site. He seemed confident that he could do the job, and then he asked to take the plans home with him so he could go over them and said he would get back to me with a quote soon. I agreed, gave him the plans, but told him I would need them back soon, and that was that. Not too long after, we met with a second contractor who we ultimately ended up hiring for the job. On Friday, I realized Joe still had the plans, and it was coming time now that the first steps were about to happen, and we needed the plans back. So I texted him, "Hey, Joe, would I be able to come get those architectural plans from you?" "Yes, I can stop by tomorrow." "Oh, I can meet you in blank town if that's easier. I need to go to the store anyway." "Okay, what time?" "Noon at the grocery store parking lot." "Sounds good." Around noon yesterday, I arrived at the grocery store parking lot. I texted Joe right away saying that I had arrived, and he showed up soon after. He pulled up next to my car and got out, and I got out as well, and noticed he was empty-handed. Confused, I asked where the plans were and if he brought them. "Oh, no," he said. "They're back at my house. Do you need them?" I was slightly annoyed at this point, so I just said yes. The guy who was prepping my site needs them. And Joe responded, "Oh, well, you can follow me back to my house and I'll give them to you." I started to feel alert at this point. Nobody but my husband knew I was meeting this guy, and I really didn't know him very well. So I asked him how far away his house was, and Joe said, "It's in the neighboring town over, 4 miles, 5 minutes. The weird vibes were growing the more that I think about it. Clearly nothing to write home about, but I was ready to get out of there at the drop of a hat if necessary. So I said to Joe, "Let me call my husband. I might not have time because we do need to be somewhere." I was giving myself an easy out. I walked away, out of earshot, so I could think straight and call my husband. Thankfully, he answered, and I told him everything that had happened so far. He agreed that it sounded a little shady and told me to be straight up with Joe and tell him I wasn't comfortable going to his house. I hung up and walked back to where Joe was waiting, and I said, "So I do have time, but I'm not going to your house because I don't know you well enough. But I will wait in the Community Development Building parking lot across from the fish factory. It's a very loud, stinky place that you can't miss." Joe seemed confused and didn't know where I was talking about. So after a bit of back and forth and trying to explain where I was going to wait, I offered to drive first and he could follow me. That way he could see where I pulled into. Then he could continue to his house, grab the plans, and meet me back there. Also, I'll mention I was proud of myself because I tend to be a bit timid and too polite, to my own detriment sometimes. This time I did not beat around the bush and was clear and concise with everything I said, like I had adopted laser focus on my delivery for once. I then got in my car and drove first, and Joe followed me and I pulled into the community development parking lot. I looked to make sure Joe saw me, and I noticed he had stopped in the middle of the empty street, and he was signaling for me to turn my car around. Since I was a good distance away, I got out of my car so I could hear what he was saying, and he was yelling for me to turn around and follow him because his house is right there. I again said no, I wasn't going to his house. I'd wait right there for him to come back. A flash of annoyance went through him, but then he nodded and continued down the street, leaving me there to wait for him to return. Less than a single minute later, he arrived back with the plans, handed them off to me, and I quickly took them, said a quick goodbye, and booked it out of there. After I got out of the situation, I was finally able to think and reflect. It took him less than 1 minute to get the plans from his house. So it's one of two things. If he lived so close by, why didn't he know where the community development building and fish factory were? He could probably see them from his house. He would have been so close. Or he had the plans with him the whole time. Also, I think it's good to note that my husband and I tried looking him up after this. There is nothing about Joe on the internet. He does not have an email, business name, or registered phone number. I don't even remember who gave me his number, and I now realize that aside from my husband, no one knows that I'd been talking to him or meeting with him. He simply doesn't exist as a contractor online, and since we never decided to use him as a contractor, I never officially looked him up until now. Ghosts Waking Me Up by Ghost Night. Over the years, I've kind of developed a sixth sense and am able to see the beyond. Over that time, I've heard a little girl speak to me, but I never really saw or fully spoke to her until this event. One early morning, as I was slowly waking up but still a bit sleepy, I noticed that my alarm clock hadn't gone off. Normally, I always wake to the sound of the alarm to get ready for work, but sometimes I also naturally wake up and lay down for a bit until it goes off. That morning, I decided to close my eyes and rest a little. And as I was resting, I felt a presence on my bed as if someone was resting on the side. In my mind's eye, I could see a little girl with blonde hair smiling back at me. She was on the floor by the bedside, and her arms were folded, placed upon the bedside, and her head was resting on her arms, looking at my face with adoration. She spoke in the same voice that I had recognized over those years. "I think you should really get up now." I mumbled, "No, let me sleep." She responded with a cheeky smile, "No, I think you really, really, really should get up now," speaking with confidence that she knew something was going to happen. In my head I thought, why on earth would I be having such a conversation? Was this a dream? It felt like it was a warning of some sort. Still half asleep, I slowly opened my eyes and quickly got up to see if she was there. But she had gone. I got a bit weirded out, but felt happy, and suddenly the alarm went off. Just seconds after that dreamlike conversation, perfect timing. That morning I kept thinking if it was just my imagination or a daydream, but I really did appreciate her for waking me up just seconds before the alarm would go off. And as I write this, I just noticed the side of my bed is a bit lopsided, as if something has left an impression, like someone has been resting on the side of the bed for a very long time on a regular basis. A couple of months later, on another morning around early spring, I had woken up to the sound of someone in my household turning the shower on in the bathroom. I didn't take much notice, as this was a regular occurrence, so I slowly went back to sleep. I had a dream, and in the dream I was an archaeologist digging up something. And in the dream I saw little bits of paper with writing on it, and noticed my name materialized on the paper. Then I heard my name being called out to me. The voice kept repeating my name over and over again. Realizing I've had such an experience before meant that someone was trying to wake me up. Much to my annoyance, I willed myself awake and looked at my surroundings. No one was there in my room, but I could still hear the shower turning on as the water was sporadically hitting the floor. I thought it was bizarre for my mind to conjure up such a scenario, as I've had this happen to me twice only for someone to be there waking me up. So to see nobody there was bizarre. I rested my head as I laid down. "Jack!" Suddenly I heard a man say my name loud and clearly in my right ear. It startled me, and my heart began to race, and I got scared, and then that fear turned to anger. I called out one of the names of the people I live with, but I got no answer. I looked at my bedroom door, still hearing the shower from the bathroom, and that gave me comfort. I guess they just didn't hear me. I slowly rested my head, but this time wide awake. The fact that a disembodied man's voice kept saying my name to wake me up really freaked me out, and I really don't want to experience that again. If anyone knows a way to stop this, I'd sure like to know. I'd much rather have the little girl wake me up, because that other voice and the way it was trying to wake me up disturbed me. Sometimes I think maybe I just have an overactive imagination, but then again I've experienced real things with others that didn't make any sense. Either way, I hope what I'm experiencing isn't anything too bad. Are Black-Eyed Children Real? By Environmental Rip. So, I know about the Black-Eyed Children creepypasta urban legend stuff, but I may have had an actual encounter with one a year ago. This happened in Portland, Oregon, around David Douglas High School. I looked up Black-Eyed Children, and there have actually been a few encounters and reports of them in Portland back in the 90s, I believe. This encounter happened to me during my high school years, so around 2009 to 2011. I can't remember the exact year. But I want to say I was about 14 at the time, and it was late, around 12 or 1 a.m., maybe a bit later. As I recall, it was a weekend. My brother and I were up watching South Park, and we heard a knocking on our garage window. Then I heard knocking at our window. We had one of those huge windows that covered the front of the house. The curtains were up, but I peeked out the side and saw a woman. She looked very pale with black hair, and her eyes were very dark. Now, she very well could have been a tweaker, but the next part creeps me out the most. After knocking on the window, she knocked on the door and asked us to let her in. Me, being the person I am, was like, hell no. But my brother, who was 10 at the time, walked over to the door and said he was going to let her in. I had to forcibly hold him down until the person left. My mom and her boyfriend woke up hearing me holding down my brother, then asked if someone knocked at the door, and I told them what had just happened. One thing I heard with the Black-Eyed Children encounters is sometimes they will force people to do things with no recollection of them doing it. And why I bring this up is that I asked my brother if he remembered the lady, the knocking, or trying to let her in, and he always tells me he doesn't. To this day, that experience creeps me out since I first heard of the Black-Eyed Children phenomenon, because everyone who's had a claim about them has said exactly what I experienced. The Man I Saw Through My Night Vision Scope by Perpetual Connection. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, It's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I had spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I'd moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. So why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but lively during the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear. It was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Was it a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could this guy have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public land. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the trees. Was that my tree he just palmed? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it. A voice coming from that direction. A very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained on the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here, and why was his voice so feminine? "Help, please, I can't walk," the voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. It's so good I mistook him for a bear. This was a fucking trap. This guy was trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit about that at the moment. I took my eyes off of him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes the animal's eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Fuck off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was, easily 6 feet, and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass, like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on the last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably lasted only a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. It wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat, and then sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone, and I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story on a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen that bastard, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home, and she was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole of these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornbury in the middle of the night. Either way, I thought I'd share. Believe what you like. These are events as I recall them. No, I'm not a writer. I Don't Think I Was Supposed to Survive by L.N. Rover. Let me start by saying I'm not a danger to myself or anything. I just have such a strange feeling and want to know what anyone else might make of it. I'm also actively in therapy, so consider that box checked. I might just be a nutcase, and I'm fully prepared to accept that. So, for as long as I can remember, I have been acutely aware of my own mortality and the impermanence of everything. Just the fact that we will die one day, and most of this stuff that we see as valuable won't matter in the end. Cars will break down and rust, buildings will decay, clothes will get worn out, school test scores will be irrelevant. Literally, for as long as I can recall from a very young age, it's just been present in me, and has been something that I have known and accepted, which has caused great peace, apathy, gratitude, depression, and overwhelming anxiety all at once, which has been very strange to process. I also always had a feeling that I wouldn't live very long, and not in a morbid way, simply something else that I had a strange feeling of knowing and acceptance for. I remember when I was probably 11 or 12, I actually told my grandma that I couldn't see myself living past 16 years old, and trying to picture a future in my adult life just felt like looking into a fuzzy hole. I swear this is what my child self was like. I know it's bizarre to think a kid would think like this, but I did. At that time, I felt like I was actively fulfilling whatever purpose I had on Earth, like I was meant to be there living my kid life, And it was furthering the plot line of my life and the people's lives I was involved in, if that makes sense. But any time I tried to picture a future past my teen years, it just seemed like I was looking into a cloud of mist or a fuzzy hole. I couldn't even picture myself or my life after high school. It's like it just wouldn't come to me in any capacity. Anyway, I lived with that feeling and just moved along with my life until October 11th, 2010. Now, 90% of the following is based on what I've heard from other people around because I don't remember a majority of it. I'd been hanging out with my best friend that evening at a park about 4 blocks down from my house. I had just adopted a puppy and we were playing with her. Around 7 p.m. when the sun was just starting to go down, we decided it was time to head back to our homes and went our separate ways. I was 1 block away from my house and almost completely across the crosswalk connecting me to another park, which was full of people. That's when I was hit by a car going 35 or 45 miles an hour, and he just didn't stop. I was 15 years old. I don't know how my body reacted. I've heard from different people that he ran over my body, that I flew up on his windshield and over the top, and that he hit me and I was propelled across the street. There's nothing but eyewitnesses to confirm, but I had some nasty road rash that seemed more consistent with having my face and body dragged across the asphalt in some way. I don't know. Several people from the park ran over to me and my puppy, one of whom had been a young lady in the grocery store parking lot just a little ways down from where it happened. She'd heard the impact and the screams from people, so she ran over to see what was going on. Turns out she'd been trying to decide if she wanted to go to veterinarian school or current with her current studies in nursing, and she had a very rare opportunity to put both practices to immediate use. I had landed on my stomach, so she didn't flip me over to try CPR just in case my spine was injured. She checked my pulse, and there was nothing. She checked for breathing. Nothing. She checked my eyes and found my pupils were fully dilated. And this girl checked me 3 times over for any signs of life, and after a long few minutes, she said she accepted that I was gone and tried to comfort my pup who was struggling. She wrapped her up in her own sweater, and sadly she passed on the scene. At the beginning of all of this, she had instructed one of the onlookers to call 911, and it took just under 10 minutes for EMTs to arrive, which I had been quite lifeless during the duration of. The girl said she remembered tucking my puppy into her sweater off in the grass, when she heard some commotion and turned to see me trying to lift myself up. She kind of panicked because I was very dead by all accounts, and she had to keep me lying down, now even more worried about my spine, until the ambulance got there and could get me stabilized. My cell phone had flown into the street and broken open, but a police officer on scene popped the battery back in, and my mom ended up calling shortly afterwards, thinking I had snuck off to my high school boyfriend's house, and that's when she was told about the accident. I had already been loaded into the ambulance and was on my way to the local hospital, so she rushed there herself. When she got there, they were intubating me, putting me on life support because I couldn't breathe on my own, and one of the EMTs told her that they were pretty shocked that I even made it on the ambulance ride back. They made the discovery that I had a brain bleed, skull fractures, and a fractured pelvis, but the hospital didn't actually have a team qualified to work on me, so they needed to get me stable enough to life flight to another city, over an hour's drive away, with a much larger hospital and capable staff. At that point, I vaguely recall coming into consciousness, feeling the tubes in my throat and hearing lots of commotion and passing back out. I don't know how long I was there, but eventually they got me breathing on my own long enough that they said I had a 50-50 chance of surviving the helicopter ride to the larger hospital, but they needed to get the brain bleed drained, so they took the chance. Spoiler alert, I survived. When I arrived, I guess there was a team waiting for me, and as they were about to start shaving my head to begin drilling burr holes, the surgeon told them to stop. Somehow he was able to tell by looking at my face that the bleed was gone, They did a CT scan, and sure enough, it had disappeared. So they sent me into surgery for my pelvis and had to place 2 6-inch long screws across my hips, and then I was in a coma for a couple of days. My first lucid memory was coming to in the hospital room and asking my mom why my butt hurt so bad. She told me about the metal screws in my hips, and I responded that I was the bionic woman, and then promptly passed out again. Over the course of 7 to 10 days I was in the hospital and seemed to be healing at an absolutely astounding rate. I kept being told that it was incredible how my body was reacting to treatment, how nothing should have gone as smoothly as it did, and they had been prepared for serious complications. There just hadn't been any. I was told several times that it was amazing that I even had mobility, let alone that I was alive. My mom had already arranged for a home school setup since there was just no way I'd be going back for the remainder of the school year. But by the time I was being discharged from the hospital, I was given the go-ahead to go back after another 2 weeks of positive progress at home. I was obviously on a ton of pain meds, and apparently my team of doctors asked to do a study on me, but I declined because I'm terrified of needles, and they were going to require blood tests. I think had I been in a more sober state of mind, I would have said yes, because I'm very curious about how things went so well myself. My short-term memory is awful now, and I have incapacitating migraines a couple of times every year. I've got pretty bad vertigo and a tremor in my right hand, but that's kind of the worst of it. All that being said, I'm now in my 30s, and ever since that event, I've just felt kind of lost, like I am just existing in other people's backgrounds. It's almost a feeling of having completed my story, so now I'm just bouncing around, taking up some awkward space, like I really don't fit in here anymore. I just have such a weird feeling that it was supposed to end that night, and now I've created some kind of weird placeholder space for myself. Can anyone else relate? Is this a common near-death experience side effect? Or something else? Or am I just a little bonkers since my noggin was rocked? Uncle Josh note here. I wanted to share this in regards to this story. Thank you so much for allowing me to read it and share that. Years ago, when I was still doing The Edge of the Unknown, and this goes back to the WECK days, one of the guests I had on was a woman named Dr. Joyce Michael Flynn. She wrote a book called Turning Tragedy into Triumph, and what she calls metahabilitation. And I think that you, the author, would very much enjoy this. I'm going to share this in our off-air comments, but I wanted to share that with anybody else out there who has ever had a near-death experience and how to come back from it. It's a very interesting read. I'm actually holding a copy of the book in my hand right now. I will put a link to that book on Amazon in the description for anybody who is interested. Sadly, I do not have the archives of that show, but she was an awesome, awesome guest. And again, her name is Dr. Joyce Michael Flynn, and her book is called Turning Tragedy into Triumph, Metahabilitation, a Contemporary Model for Rehabilitation. Stranger in My House by Meteor Shower. Last night, I woke to the unsettling noise of loud banging and my dog's frantic barking. Living alone with my girlfriend, I've grown accustomed to our neighbors' domestic disputes, and I've had to call the police often. I stumbled to the bathroom as the walls there are thin and separated our duplex from theirs. As I approached the bathroom door, the entire house was dark, and a tall shadow was in my bathtub. I wasn't wearing my glasses, and I'm incredibly nearsighted, so I struggled to discern whether the shadow was merely the shower curtain or what it was. Then the shadow spoke. I don't know what he said, but the gut-wrenching panic I felt is still fresh. I screamed and fled back to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My girlfriend, now awake and terrified, joined me as I called the police. They instructed me to lock the door, but my bedroom doesn't have one. With the banging growing louder and more aggressive, I braced myself against the door, praying that help would arrive in time. To my relief, The police arrived swiftly, in only 5 minutes. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, I found that they had dragged him naked from the bathtub because he'd been trying to shower. They were questioning him on my couch while he was handcuffed. He was incredibly drunk and had wandered into the wrong house. On the one night, we forgot to lock the doors. But to the drunk, naked stranger who saw me squinting at him, pantsless in the dark, let's not meet. Uncle Josh note. The author of this story has shared a TikTok of what went down that night. Find that in the description. And I know I'm kind of smiling when I say this and was smiling when I read this. I'm not discounting it. That is terribly freaky and really fucked up and scary. I don't want to think about this kind of a situation with my family, and I gotta be honest, he at least kept his head on his shoulders and did the right thing. I'm not so sure that I would if a stranger was in my house taking a shower. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, share it with a friend, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the stories, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you're not following me on social media, please do. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and X. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel a bit further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description below, as well as a link to my storefront on tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.